Nobody inside the WNBA expected the shift to happen this fast. Not the front office. Not the veterans. Not even the sponsors who had been cautiously investing in women's basketball for decades. Everyone knew Caitlin Clark was popular. Everyone knew she brought eyes, ratings, and attention the league hadn't seen before. But popularity is one thing. Power is something else entirely. The moment that power became undeniable wasn't a game-winning shot or a record-breaking performance. It was a signature. When the news broke that Clark had secured a massive endorsement deal with Nike, reportedly worth tens of millions over the long term, the conversation around her changed overnight. This wasn't just another rookie endorsement. This wasn't a standard shoe deal or a short-term marketing experiment. This was Nike planting a flag and saying, without saying it out loud, this is the future we're betting on. Inside league circles, that message landed heavy. For nearly 3 decades, the WNBA survived by controlling growth carefully. Stars were promoted, but the league itself always came first. The shield mattered more than the individual name on the jersey. No single player was supposed to arrive and instantly outrank the system. That balance wasn't written into any rulebook, but it was understood by everyone who had spent time inside the league. Clark's Nike deal shattered that understanding. Suddenly, a rookie who hadn't even logged a full professional season was being positioned as a global face of women's basketball. Not a contributor. Not a future star. A centerpiece. To fans, it felt exciting. To sponsors, it felt overdue. But to parts of the league, it felt like a loss of control. And that's where the tension started. Because the deal didn't just represent money. It represented leverage. Nike wasn't buying Clark's past accomplishments. They were buying her ability to move culture, sell tickets, and shift attention away from the league's traditional hierarchy. That kind of investment sends a signal, whether anyone admits it or not. It tells executives, players, and media outlets that the power dynamic has already changed, even if the league isn't ready to acknowledge it publicly. This is where the resentment quietly began to build. For years, veteran players had carried the league through low salaries, limited travel accommodations, and minimal media coverage. Many of them played overseas in the off-season just to make their careers sustainable. They built the infrastructure that made today's growth possible. And now, without warning, a newcomer was being handed generational wealth and global marketing before she had even unpacked her locker. From a human perspective, that's hard to swallow. From a business perspective, it's even more complicated. Because once Nike made that move, the league was no longer fully in charge of its own narrative. A global corporation had effectively chosen its star. And while the WNBA still controlled the games, the schedule, and the rules, it no longer fully controlled the story people were showing up to watch. That's the part nobody wanted to say out loud. This wasn't just about Caitlin Clark being talented. It was about what happens when a league built on collective identity suddenly has to operate in a superstar economy. The WNBA wasn't designed for a moment like this. It was designed for steady progress, shared spotlight, and controlled growth. Clark's deal forced everything into fast forward. And when systems are pushed faster than they're ready for, they don't adapt quietly. They push back. Not with press releases. Not with official statements. But with tone shifts, silence, and subtle resistance that only becomes obvious once it's already too late. This wasn't the beginning of Caitlin Clark's career. It was the beginning of the league's discomfort with how big she was becoming, and how little say they had in stopping it. From the outside, the reaction didn't make sense. A young star secures a massive endorsement. A global brand invests in women's basketball. Fans celebrate. Ratings spike. By every modern sports metric, this should have been a victory lap. Inside the league, it felt very different. To understand why, you have to understand what the money represented. Not just the amount, but the timing. When Caitlin Clark entered the league, she didn't walk into a financial vacuum. She walked into a system shaped by scarcity. For nearly 30 years, players had been told the same story. Growth takes time, revenue isn't there yet, patience is required. Salaries reflected that philosophy. Travel reflected it. Marketing budgets reflected it. The maximum WNBA salary hovered around figures that, in most professional sports, wouldn't even register as mid-tier. Many veterans spent their winters overseas, logging brutal minutes in foreign leagues just to make their careers financially viable. This wasn't a secret. It was the unspoken cost of playing at the highest level in women's basketball. Then the Nike number dropped. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about slow growth anymore. It was about how a rookie, before playing a full professional season, could command a deal that eclipsed what many veterans would earn across their entire careers. Even if the reported figures were spread across years, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. This wasn't incremental progress. This was a leap, and not everyone was invited to make it. That's where the emotional disconnect started. For fans, Clark's deal felt like justice. Proof that women's basketball had finally broken through. Evidence that marketability, skill, and star power could be rewarded at the highest level. But inside locker rooms, the math felt personal. Players who had sacrificed their bodies, their time, and their earning potential looked at that deal and saw something else entirely. A system that suddenly found money the moment a single player became unavoidable. And that creates a dangerous thought. Not jealousy in the childish sense. Not bitterness for success. But a quiet question that sits in the back of your mind and refuses to leave. Why now? Why did the doors open only after one person arrived? Why did the league suddenly become profitable enough for charter flights, endorsement buzz, and national attention when we were told for years that none of it was possible? That question doesn't stay abstract for long. Because when money enters a space unevenly, it changes how effort is perceived. The Nike deal wasn't just rewarding Clark's shooting range or her popularity. To many veterans, it felt like it was rewriting history, as if the league had been dormant until she showed up. As if the grind that came before didn't matter unless it led directly to her moment. That's where resentment turns structural. This wasn't about one endorsement creating envy. It was about the league's entire economic narrative collapsing in real time. If a rookie could command that level of investment immediately, then what had everyone else been sacrificing for all these years? Were they simply unlucky? Or were they part of a system that needed someone else's face to finally unlock value? Those questions don't get answered in press conferences. They get answered in tone, in body language, in how tightly defenders play, in how forgiving the environment becomes, or doesn't, when mistakes happen. And once the money conversation shifted, everything else followed. Because when a player enters the league already economically untouchable, she stops being just another rookie. She becomes a symbol, a measuring stick. A reminder of what the league could have been sooner, and didn't become until it had no choice. That's why the deal didn't feel like progress to everyone. To some, it felt like being told the work only mattered once someone else arrived to collect the reward. The money alone would have caused tension. But the moment things truly boiled over wasn't a contract announcement or a leaked dollar figure. It was a commercial. When Nike released its ad centered entirely around Caitlin Clark, the imagery landed louder than any press release ever could. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't cautious. It wasn't framed as a team story or a league celebration. It was focused, cinematic, and intentional. Clark alone in the gym. Clark drilling shots from impossible distance. Clark framed not as a participant, but as the standard. To fans, it looked inspiring, clean, aspirational. The kind of marketing women's basketball had waited years to receive. Inside the league, it landed like a provocation. Because the message wasn't just, this player works hard. The message, whether intended or not, was, this is what elite looks like now. And when you elevate one person that clearly, everyone else becomes a comparison by default. That's when discomfort turns into resistance. For years, the league worked carefully to avoid exactly this scenario. Marketing efforts spread attention across stars, teams, and narratives. The idea was to protect the ecosystem, not crown a single ruler. Nike ignored that philosophy entirely. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't hedge. They didn't balance the frame. They chose. And once a global brand chooses, the hierarchy changes whether the league approves or not. What bothered people most wasn't that Clark was featured. It was that the rest of the league was absent. No legends. No veterans. No nod to the players who built the foundation. The ad didn't say the WNBA mattered before Clark arrived. It implied the opposite by omission. That's where the word erasure started getting whispered. Not in tweets. Not in interviews. In locker rooms. In private conversations. In the kind of off-camera frustration that doesn't need to be said out loud to be understood. When you've been grinding for a decade and a rookie is presented as the entire story, it doesn't feel like marketing. It feels like replacement. And the timing made it worse. This wasn't released after a championship run or a dominant professional season. This was early. Almost aggressively early. To many players, it felt like Nike was skipping the proving stage entirely and fast-forwarding straight to coronation. That matters in a league where respect has always been earned slowly, often painfully. The commercial didn't just elevate Clark. It redefined what mattered. Distance shooting. Arena sellouts. Viral moments. Social traction. Those became the new currency overnight. And while Clark excelled at all of it, plenty of players who had dominated through defense, leadership, and consistency suddenly found themselves invisible in the new equation. That's when the tension stopped being theoretical. Because once the league saw that Nike could override its internal balance with a single ad, a new fear set in. If the brand controls the narrative, then the league no longer dictates who gets celebrated, protected, or prioritized. It becomes reactive instead of authoritative. And that's dangerous for any organization built on collective identity. The commercial didn't just sell shoes. It forced a question the league wasn't ready to answer. If the face of women's basketball has already been chosen by someone else, what role does the league actually play? That question didn't get answered immediately. But it lingered. And the longer it lingered, the more strained everything became. The situation might have cooled down if leadership had stepped in decisively. A clear message. A firm line. Something that acknowledged the tension and shut down the worst parts of it. That moment never came. Instead, the temperature rose. As scrutiny around Caitlin Clark intensified, attention shifted toward the league office and, more specifically, Commissioner Kathy Engelbert. This was the moment where the WNBA needed authority more than optics. What it got felt closer to branding language than leadership. When asked publicly about the growing hostility surrounding Clark, the fan base wars, the online harassment, the increasingly physical on-court play, the response wasn't a firm condemnation. There was no sharp rejection of the ugliness forming around the conversation. Instead, the framing leaned toward rivalry, toward engagement, toward the idea that tension and friction were simply part of the entertainment cycle. On paper, that might sound harmless. In reality, it landed like permission. Because when the highest authority in the league treats escalating hostility as good for business, it sends a message down the entire chain. Players hear it. Coaches hear it. Officials hear it. And fans hear it loudest of all. It suggests that as long as the spotlight stays bright, the league is willing to tolerate the chaos underneath. That's where the disconnect became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a playful rivalry unfolding naturally. It was a volatile mix of identity, economics, and power playing out in real time. Reducing that to good for ratings made it feel like the league was more interested in monetizing the moment than protecting the people inside it. That perception hit a breaking point when the WNBA felt compelled to step in. Think about how rare that is. Players' unions usually negotiate contracts. They don't publicly correct commissioners on matters of tone and responsibility. But this time, the silence from the top was so loud that the union had to clarify what leadership wouldn't. They made it clear that harassment, racialized discourse, and escalating hostility weren't marketing tools. They weren't storylines. They were real problems with real consequences. The fact that this statement had to come from the players instead of the league office said everything. It told the public that the league either couldn't or wouldn't draw a firm boundary. And when boundaries disappear, behavior changes. Aggression becomes justified. Silence becomes endorsement. And players who are already under the microscope start feeling exposed rather than supported. For Clark, the message was subtle but unmistakable. You bring attention. You bring money. But you are still part of a system that won't step in when things get uncomfortable. That's not how superstars are usually handled in professional sports. When the NBA faced similar moments with its generational talents, the response was protection, not ambiguity. The WNBA, by contrast, seemed caught between wanting Clark's impact and fearing her influence. And that hesitation created a vacuum. In that vacuum, narratives filled the space. Fans took sides. Media leaned into conflict. Players felt emboldened to test limits. And without clear leadership to slow things down, the pressure shifted from the boardroom to the court. That's when the warning stopped being verbal. It became physical. Once the tone at the top became unclear, the court absorbed the tension. What followed didn't look like a normal rookie adjustment period. It looked like a test. Every possession involving Caitlin Clark carried extra weight. She wasn't just being guarded. She was being challenged, pressed, bumped, and crowded in ways that went beyond routine competitiveness. Full-court pressure became standard. Screens came harder. Contact lingered longer than usual. And the whistle, at least to many watching, felt inconsistent. This is where perception matters more than intent. Because even if every defender believed they were simply playing hard, the cumulative effect told a different story. Fans didn't see tough defense. They saw a message being sent. A league-wide reminder that hype doesn't translate to protection, and money doesn't buy you space. The moment that crystallized, everything came off the ball. During a routine inbound sequence, Clark wasn't even part of the immediate play. The ball wasn't live in her hands. And yet she was blindsided by a hard hip check that sent her to the floor. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't basketball positioning. It was contact for contact's sake. What happened next mattered just as much as the hit itself. The officials called it a common foul. No immediate escalation. No strong response. No sense that the league recognized the optics of what had just occurred. Only after the clip went viral, replayed millions of times across social media and sports networks, did the ruling change. The foul was upgraded later, quietly, after public pressure made inaction impossible. That delay spoke volumes. Because in professional sports, consistency is protection. When stars are protected, lines are drawn quickly. When they're not, the gray area expands. And gray areas invite more testing. Players start to wonder how far they can go before consequences arrive. The message that spread wasn't complicated. This is a league where you earn safety the hard way. For longtime fans of other major sports, the contrast was jarring. When generational players in men's leagues absorb non-basket contact, the response is immediate and decisive. The goal isn't favoritism. It's asset protection. Leagues don't apologize for shielding the players who drive attention, revenue, and long-term growth. Here, the hesitation felt intentional. And that hesitation fed a narrative that Clark wasn't just expected to adjust, she was expected to endure. To prove she belonged not through performance alone, but through punishment. That's a dangerous standard, especially when it's applied unevenly. As the season progressed, the pattern became harder to dismiss. Clark drew attention for technical fouls, for visible frustration, for reactions that many fans felt were born from accumulated contact rather than attitude. Instead of the conversation focusing on her playmaking or shooting, it shifted toward whether she was handling it the right way. That's how systems deflect responsibility. Instead of asking why a rookie was facing relentless physical pressure, the focus moved to how she responded to it. Instead of questioning officiating consistency, debates centered on toughness, entitlement, and humility. The warning was no longer subtle. You can bring fans. You can bring money. But you still have to survive the gauntlet. And survival, in this case, wasn't just about staying on your feet. It was about navigating a league that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to protect its biggest momentum or test how much pressure she could withstand before pushing back. That question was about to get answered somewhere else. Not on the court. On a roster sheet. If there was any doubt that the tension around Caitlin Clark had moved beyond whispers and body language, it disappeared the moment the Olympic roster was announced. This wasn't just another selection process. This was the most symbolic stage in women's basketball. The Olympics aren't about marketing campaigns or social media buzz. They're about legitimacy, hierarchy, and institutional trust. And when Clark's name was missing from the list, the message was impossible to misread. Officially, the explanation was simple. Experience. Chemistry. Continuity. The same words that get used every cycle to justify tough cuts. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In context, it felt deliberate. Because this wasn't a fringe player being left home. This was the most watched, most discussed, and most commercially powerful figure in women's basketball at that moment. Leaving her off the roster didn't quiet the noise. It amplified it. The Olympics are supposed to be a showcase of the sport's present and future. By excluding Clark, the establishment made a different statement entirely. They reminded everyone that popularity doesn't override internal control. That no matter how loud the fans are or how big the brand deals become, the gatekeepers still decide who represents the league on its biggest stage. That's why this decision felt different. It wasn't framed as punishment, but it functioned like one. A reminder that stardom doesn't grant immunity. A signal to Clark's camp, to sponsors, and to fans that the league and its affiliated institutions weren't ready to hand over the keys just yet. What made it even louder was who stayed silent afterward. There was no public defense. No strong advocacy from league leadership pushing for her inclusion. No sense that the system was willing to bend, even slightly, to reflect the reality of the moment. The absence of pushback spoke just as clearly as the roster itself. And instead of calming things down, the decision backfired. The conversation around the Olympics shifted almost instantly. It wasn't about gold medals or matchups anymore. It was about why the most influential player in the sport wasn't there. Every game Team USA played carried an asterisk in the public imagination. Fans weren't asking how dominant the team looked. They were asking what the selection said about the league's priorities. In trying to protect tradition, the system exposed its fear of change. Because this wasn't about whether Clark would have played heavy minutes. It was about optics. About acknowledgement. About recognizing that the sport had entered a new phase, whether leadership was comfortable with it or not. Instead, the message landed hard and clear. We decide the stars. We decide the timeline. And no one moves faster than we allow. That moment solidified what many fans had already suspected. The resistance wasn't accidental. It was institutional. And once institutions feel threatened, they don't lash out emotionally. They assert control quietly, through policy, selection, and silence. The Olympic omission wasn't the end of the story. It was proof that the power struggle had reached its highest level. After the Olympic decision, something subtle but important happened behind the scenes. The conversation stopped being emotional and started becoming structural. When institutions feel pressure they can't fully control, they don't argue louder, they reorganize. That's exactly what began to happen around the governance of women's basketball. Reports started circulating that Sue Bird, one of the most respected figures in the sport, was being positioned to take on a major leadership role in shaping the future of the women's national team program. On the surface, it looked like a natural transition. A legend moving into management. Experience replacing controversy. Stability replacing noise. But timing matters. This shift didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after months of tension, criticism, and public scrutiny tied directly to the Clark effect. It came after leadership missteps. After backlash from players. After fans started questioning whether the league and its partners were equipped to handle the attention they had always claimed to want. That's what made this move feel reactive rather than routine. The system wasn't just adjusting for the future. It was fortifying itself against another moment like this one. Bringing in a universally respected figure wasn't about innovation. It was about control. About restoring trust internally while projecting calm externally. From a strategic standpoint, it made sense. If the league could recenter authority around familiar faces and establish credibility, it could slow the narrative drift caused by outside forces like Nike, social media, and fan-driven star elevation. It could remind everyone that while brands and audiences move fast, institutions move deliberately. But there was a risk embedded in that strategy. Because the sport itself had already changed. The audience had changed. The economics had changed. Trying to govern a superstar-driven attention economy with systems designed for a slower, quieter era creates friction, not stability. This is where Caitlin Clark's presence became impossible to separate from the future of the league. She wasn't just a player navigating her rookie season anymore. She had become a stress test. Every decision made around governance, messaging, officiating, and roster construction was now being interpreted through the lens of how the league handles power it didn't create. And the more the system tried to reassert itself, the clearer that tension became. Fans noticed. Media noticed. Sponsors noticed. Moves that might have gone unnoticed in previous years were suddenly analyzed for motive. Was this about development? Or was it about drawing lines? That's the downside of transparency in the modern sports landscape. Once people sense a power struggle, neutrality disappears. Every action feels intentional, whether it is or not. By this point, the league wasn't just managing a season. It was managing perception. And perception, once it turns skeptical, is incredibly hard to reverse. The question looming over everything wasn't whether Caitlin Clark would succeed on the court. That was never in doubt. The real question was whether the system around her could evolve fast enough to handle what she represented, without trying to contain it, dilute it, or slow it down. Because once a league starts rearranging itself under pressure, one truth becomes unavoidable. The old structure isn't strong enough for what's coming. At this point, pretending this is just another rookie storyline misses the reality entirely. What's unfolding around Caitlin Clark isn't about growing pains or media overreaction. It's about control, who holds it, who benefits from it, and who feels threatened when it shifts. The league didn't lose control because of one player. It lost control because the environment changed faster than its systems were designed to handle. A superstar economy arrived before the infrastructure was ready. A global brand moved first. Fans followed. And suddenly, the WNBA found itself reacting instead of leading. That's the danger zone for any sports league. When momentum is driven by outside forces, every internal decision becomes fragile. Officiating choices feel political. Roster decisions feel symbolic. Silence feels intentional. And the longer that dynamic exists, the more fans start believing the system is working against its own growth rather than guiding it. Caitlin Clark didn't create that tension. She exposed it. She represents a future where attention is instant, narratives are global, and individual stars can shift revenue streams almost overnight. For a league built on patience and collective identity, that future feels destabilizing. But ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. Trying to humble it through inaction doesn't slow it down. It only sends the audience elsewhere. That's the part leadership has to understand. Fans don't tune in for internal politics. They tune in for excellence, momentum, and authenticity. When they sense that a league is uncomfortable with its own success, they disengage. And once casual fans leave, they don't come back easily. This moment will be remembered one way or another. Either as the season when the league learned how to protect growth without erasing its past, or as the season where resistance stalled the biggest opportunity women's basketball has ever had. And the outcome won't be decided by press releases or interviews. It'll be decided by patterns, by consistency, by whether the league chooses to guide the future, or keep bracing against it. If you made it this far, it tells the algorithm one very important thing. This conversation matters. This channel is still small, and YouTube only pushes content like this when it sees clear signals of engagement. Subscribing helps more than you think. Liking the video tells the system this topic deserves reach. And leaving a comment, even a short one, trains the algorithm to recommend this breakdown to more basketball fans who are trying to understand what's really happening behind the scenes. If you want more deep dives like this, longer, more detailed, and without recycled talking points, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and drop a comment with your perspective. It directly impacts whether this kind of content continues. This story isn't over. And the next chapter is already unfolding.